Hi, and welcome to That Cancer Conversation, the podcast from Cancer Research UK that brings together the science and the stories behind cancer with me, Sophie. We know that food and diet can play a vital role in our long-term health, but various news stories can make us confused on what we should and shouldn't eat for a healthy lifestyle. This can lead to health misinformation, where foods are claimed to supposedly cause cancer, but can foods really be cancerous? In this episode, I'm joined by Dr. Marc Gunter, a professor and chair in cancer epidemiology and prevention at Imperial College London, where his research mainly focuses on the role of nutrition and obesity in cancer development. Marc, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
So, to start off, I just want to ask, what is the relationship between food and cancer, if there is a relationship?
Okay, so it's a very complex and difficult question to answer, and it's been a subject of intense research for several decades now. So as you said, we know that nutrition plays a vital role in maintaining our bodies and healthy physiology. And I think there's a large body of evidence suggesting that certain components of food could potentially have cancer preventive or cancer causing effects. So there's a whole multitude of studies showing, for example, that compounds found in fruits and vegetables can have anti-cancer effects. And these are studies from cells and in animal models. Where it gets really complicated, though, is to actually study this in humans, because we know that diet is extremely complex. So when you eat a single food, often it contains hundreds of thousands of different compounds, all of which could have their own bioactive properties. And also we know that certain types of diet and certain foods are correlated with other health behaviours which might be related to cancer. So, for example, smoking or drinking or socioeconomic status, obesity. So trying to disentangle the effects of particular foods and nutrients on cancer risk in large population-based human studies is actually very challenging. But I think over recent decades we have arrived at certain conclusions regarding some aspects of the diet in relation to cancer risk.
What sort of things, what sort of foods have we looked at in particular, or that we're seeing this sort of risk development?
So I would say there's one food which there is conclusive evidence that it can be a carcinogen, and that's processed meat. So the International Agency for Research on Cancer, they classified processed meat as a class 1 carcinogen. So it's effectively in the same category as smoking and alcohol. So they conclude that there's definitive evidence that eating processed food, eating processed meat can increase your risk of bowel cancer. Red meat has also been classified as probable carcinogen for bowel cancer. So I would say they're the only two foods for which we have really definitive evidence that they're cancer causing.
And with carcinogen, what does that mean? Does that mean it definitely causes cancer, or?
Yes. So carcinogen means it's a factor which is a direct cause of cancer.
And you said that it's a class 1. Are there other different classes, and what's the difference between them?
So the classes are determined based on the strength of the evidence. So for a food or a compound to be a class 1 carcinogen, it needs to have really strong evidence in human studies and also in animal and experimental studies that it's causing cancer. So for processed meat and bowel cancer, there's a large body of epidemiological evidence suggesting that people who are eating higher amounts of processed meat have a higher risk of bowel cancer. And there's also animal and experimental studies showing that certain factors or compounds found in processed meats can have direct carcinogenic effects.
I guess in terms of other foods, we see a lot of different headlines claiming, don't eat this, don't eat this. What does that all actually mean? And is it actually talking about this food could cause cancer in humans, or is it taking some of the science and making a story out of it that's not necessarily true?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of interest in diet and cancer for obvious reasons. I mean, we all eat. We're all at risk of cancer. So I think diet and nutrition is something people can relate to. So obviously any studies or headlines which kind of make claims about the cancer-causing effects or preventive effects of certain foods is going to attract a lot of attention. I do think there's been a lot of sensationalism for certain studies. So I think many times some of the research that we see reported in the press can be from experimental studies in animals or in cells, which can be important evidence, but doesn't necessarily tell the whole picture. It's actually very challenging to investigate diet in human studies because I guess the gold standard of research in human studies is a randomized controlled trial, and we can't really do that for diet and nutrition. We can't kind of randomize people to certain diets in the same way we could do for example, a drug, because people are going to eat different foods and the nutrition is so complex. So what we do, we rely on very large population-based studies where we follow thousands of people over decades and obtain information on what they're eating, as well as other information, other risk factors, blood samples. And over time, some of those people develop certain cancers, and then we can see what was it about their diet or their lifestyle which led one group of people to develop bowel cancer, for example, compared to others who remained healthy. So they're really the cornerstone of research in humans on diet and cancer. But those studies also have their limitations. As I said, diet is actually very difficult to measure. And often these studies rely on a single assessment of diet, where people record what they've been eating in the last week, or they report the frequency by which they normally eat certain foods. And we know that people misreport, they inaccurately remember, and also diets change. So over time, particularly, for example, in this country, people's diets have changed a lot in the last 20 or 30 years. So if we don't capture that change within our studies, that can also be a limitation.
I mean, it does sound really complex when you break it down into having to remember what you've eaten. You know, I sometimes struggle to remember what I've eaten in a day, and let alone having to report that accurately.
Yes.
And to try and draw conclusions from that must be actually quite difficult to do, especially when you're trying to do it over a large body of time with various different diets. And then if you're only focusing, I guess, on the relationship between cancer risk and one food, that's going to be really hard to find that kind of seamless statement to pull out, because there's just so many different, chemicals at play, because food are essentially built up of different chemicals. So they're all going to interact with each other quite differently as well. And that must be so hard to just kind of isolate within itself.
Yeah. And also they interact with our metabolism, and also the gut microbiome, for example. So you and I might eat exactly the same foods, but because we have differences in our metabolism and also in our gut microbiota, the compounds which our cells become exposed to from our diets could actually be quite different, which could influence our cancer risk.
And I mean, the microbiomes become a very hot topic as well. A lot of people are trying to eat foods to help their microbiome. What's the relationship, do we know, about the microbiome and, say, cancer risk?
So, as you say, I mean, there's been a lot of interest in the gut microbiome in recent years. So our intestines contain trillions and trillions of bacteria. And for many years, we assumed these were just an inert aspect of our bodies and weren't really contributing to our health. We now know that's not true. So the gut microbiome is extremely metabolically active. It produces a whole range of different compounds and hormones, metabolic factors, metabolites, which could have their effects on health and influence cancer risk. We don't currently know for sure how the gut microbiome might influence cancer risk. There's a lot of emerging research suggesting that certain bacteria can influence the progression of bowel cancer, but we don't know how the gut microbiome could actually cause or contribute to cancer developing in the first place. And that's really because we don't have good good available data currently. So we don't have measurements of the microbiome in large-scale prospective studies, for example. So I think this field is emerging or evolving. And I think in the coming decade or so, I think we'll see more definitive conclusions regarding the role of the microbiome in cancer risk. But I do think it could be an important interplay between the diet and cancer, because we know that the microbiome converts a lot of the compounds found in our diet to certain bioactive compounds, which might have an influence on metabolism and cancer risk.
And what about metabolism? How does that play into cancer risk as well?
So metabolism is essentially the sum of all the chemical processes which take place within our cells. And we know that there are certain metabolic factors, for example, insulin and other hormones, metabolites, which play a role in metabolism, are likely to be involved in cancer development. So, for example, we know that people who have high levels of insulin have a higher risk of certain cancers, such as colorectal cancer, liver cancer, pancreatic cancer. So we know that differences in the way that our metabolism and how our body reacts to diet could influence our cancer risk. But again, I think this research is really at the kind of we're at the beginning of this research field. I think the availability of very large population-based studies where we've got blood measurements and we can measure, for example, metabolites or hormones and relate those to cancer risk. I think that will help us understand the role of metabolism in cancer development.
And also, I'm thinking about ultra-processed foods. There's a lot of talk about ultra-processed foods and the way that it impacts our gut microbiome, our metabolism. First of all, what are ultra-processed foods?
So ultra-processed foods are foods which have been industrially produced. And they typically contain compounds such as emulsifiers, additives, colorant compounds, which have been produced to make the food more palatable or to enhance certain flavors. So in recent decades, the prevalence of these ultra-processed foods has become greater in the population in this country and others, and people are consuming more of them. We don't know about their effects on cancer risk definitively. We do know that they're related to obesity. So they're highly obesogenic. So people who consume more ultra-processed foods tend to gain weight. They tend to become diabetic. It tends to lead to metabolic dysregulation. So obesity itself is a risk factor for at least 13 different cancers. So that's one potential pathway by which ultra-processed foods could be related to cancer development. But there is a lot of interest in whether certain aspects of ultra-processed foods, so certain compounds such as additives, emulsifiers, other synthetic chemicals, whether they can have a direct effect on cancer risk. That's still an open question. There are epidemiological studies showing that people who are consuming a diet which is richer in ultra-processed foods have a higher risk of colorectal cancer, possibly breast cancer. And there is experimental data showing that some of the compounds found in ultra-processed foods could have tumour-promoting effects. But again, it hasn't been definitively proven that these compounds cause cancer in humans.
And I'm just thinking about, we've been talking about foods that may cause an increased risk in cancer. But there are also reports of people saying foods that have a cancer prevention aspect.
Yeah.
Is that true? Can certain foods prevent cancer?
Yes. So I think the short answer is yes. But again, there's a lot we don't know about in this area. So we do know that dietary fibre, for example, is protective against bowel cancer. So it's been shown both in human studies that people who are consuming more dietary fibre and more whole grains have a lower risk of bowel cancer. And we know from mechanistic studies and experimental studies that fibre is likely to have a protective effect on bowel cancer. So, for example, We know that dietary fibre reduces insulin. We know that there are certain compounds that the gut microbiota produce from fibre, such as short-chain fatty acids, and these could have an effect on lowering bowel cancer risk.
And I just wanted to say that you keep using the term risk. So what is it that we mean by that? Because it's not essentially saying if you eat this way, you will never get cancer. I assume it's just saying the likeliness is reducing.
Yeah, so it's really about the likelihood so it's really the probability of developing cancer. So we could say that people who are consuming the highest amount of fibre have, for example, a 20% lower risk of developing bowel cancer compared to people who are eating the smallest amount of fibre.
And that would mean, like, it doesn't mean maybe those people won't get cancer. It just means that they're just less likely to get it than this group of people.
Exactly.
So, yeah, I think because we get quite a few people saying, like, well, I eat this way and yet I still got cancer. I don't understand why.
Yeah.
When I'm living a healthy lifestyle and having a healthy diet, and how, I guess, people still can get cancer.
Yeah. I think of cancer as it's always a kind of game of risk. So there are a small proportion of people who inherit certain genetic mutations, which mean that if you do inherit one of those mutations, you have a very high risk of developing breast cancer. So, for example, the BRCA gene mutation, if you inherit that you have a high risk of developing breast cancer. But for the majority of people, you can there is a chance element of cancer that you acquire mutations when your cells replicate, for example. But I think you can modify your chances based on your lifestyle, including your diet. So we know that people who, for example, eat diets which are very rich in whole foods, so fruits, vegetables, fibre, and lower in ultra-processed foods, they have a lower risk of developing bowel cancer and possibly other cancers.
I wanted to ask you about the term superfoods, because it's a term that gets thrown around every now and then, and it may be some food item is said to be really healthy and have high, we hear the term high in antioxidants, but we kind of all go along with the statements and the hype around it, and we'll buy a certain type of fruit because it's this quote unquote superfood. But what do you think on those sorts of terms?
I'm never quite sure what a superfood is. I mean, I think it's a term that's been developed to try and hype up certain foods. So I think it generally means foods which are rich in certain compounds which have been linked to improved health. So high levels of certain vitamins, antioxidants, as you say, other minerals or kind of phytochemicals, bioactive compounds from plants, for example, which have been shown in experimental studies to potentially lower risk of cancer. But I don't think many of these things have been proven in human studies currently. I mean, antioxidants is an interesting area. So we know that our cells are constantly under oxidative stress, and that this oxidation can lead to mutations in DNA, which in theory could lead to cancer. So eating foods which combat that oxidative stress, again, in theory, could lower your risk of cancer, because it means that there's less chance that DNA damage will occur and less chance then that there'll be a mutation which could be linked to cancer. But and certainly, as I said, experimental studies have shown that there are compounds found in fruits and vegetables, for example, which have very potent antioxidant. They mop up oxidative chemicals. But proving that in human studies, again, is really tricky. So the field is really littered with inconsistencies regarding the association between fruits and vegetables and antioxidants from those and different cancers. Aside from maybe colorectal cancer, I think there is a general consensus that a diet rich in fruits and vegetables lowers risk of colorectal cancer. But I think for other cancers, we still really don't know.
And also, it could be more down to the fibre rather than, say, these antioxidant properties.
Exactly.
And then that's even harder to differentiate what is the specific reason that these mix of fruit and vegetables are helping lower people's risk of developing bowel cancer, colorectal cancer.
Yeah.
And also, like you said, it's certain cancers which have lowered risk with certain, including high fibre and certain diets. It's not, we have 200 different types of cancers, and sometimes diet just doesn't play a role with all of them.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, I would say the strongest evidence we have is for colorectal cancer. So we know that dietary fibre, diets which are rich in calcium, lower risk of colorectal cancer, and possibly fruits and vegetables, whereas diets rich in processed and red meat raise the risk of bowel cancer. For other cancers, I think there's still a lot that we don't know. There have been there are a few exceptions. So, for example, coffee. There's pretty strong evidence now that coffee reduces risk of endometrial cancer, so the lining of the womb, liver cancer, possibly colorectal cancer. And then, as I said, obesity, which obviously is strongly linked to diet, is a risk factor for at least 13 different cancer types. So reducing your calorie intake and maintaining a healthy weight and being more physically active and reducing obesity would be preventive for at least 13 different cancers.
In terms of what work you're doing, I mean, you're part of our Cancer Grand Challenges team, Prominent. What sort of things are you looking at in terms of nutrition and cancer risk?
So within Prominent, Prominent is a Cancer Grand Challenge project focused on understanding the role of cancer promoters. This idea that there are certain cancer risk factors which don't cause mutations by themselves, but they act on cells which already have a mutation and act as a cancer promoter. So within Prominent, I'm leading a body of work where we're doing human intervention studies, primarily looking at the effects of obesity and smoking on cancer promotion. So, for example, for obesity, we're recruiting people through bariatric surgery clinics, and we're taking biopsies of normal tissues, so endometrial, breast and bowel tissue, from people at the time that they have obesity and they're about to go through bariatric surgery. And then roughly 12 months later, after they've lost weight, we take a second biopsy. And that allows us to look at changes within their tissue, so changes in the biology of their tissues. And that will enable us to see when someone loses weight, how does that change your metabolism? How does it change the biology of your cells? And could that give us some clues as to, firstly, how obesity might be causing cancer, but also potential preventive pathways. So if we see that certain pathways are downregulated when people lose weight, that might give us some clues as to that's a potential prevention pathway for cancer.
We go to do our food shopping. We have a lot of foods on offer to us. And how do you think society and economic status and stuff like that impacts the likeliness and somebody's risk of getting cancer?
So I think that's a really important question. So my advice about diet and cancer prevention would be to try to adopt a diet that's rich in fruits, vegetables, whole foods, fibre, and try to reduce intake of red and processed meat and more processed foods. That's really tricky if you're depending on where you live. So particularly in this country, I think we've seen growing disparities in availability of certain foods. So foods have got more expensive, so fruits and vegetables actually become more costly, whereas many of these ultra-processed, industrially produced foods actually become cheaper. So we are starting to see that people who maybe have greater disposable income or wealthier, they tend to adopt certain diets which are kind of richer in these kind of fruits, vegetables, healthier foods, whereas maybe people from lower socioeconomic groups who have less available income might be eating more processed food, and I think that potentially creates more health disparities. So, for example, we already know that obesity is more prevalent among people from more disadvantaged groups, which would be contributing to greater cancer risk.
I think it's easy to feel like you have control over your diet, but actually, when you look at the pricing of things and also time as well, it's a lot harder to implement these recommendations that researchers are giving from the science.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is where we need more public health policy to try to improve access to healthier foods in certain segments of the population. I mean, this is a big question around kind of the role of the food industry and ultra processed foods and how they've become so dominant in society and affordable to many people. And I think this is an area where there needs to be more focus of the government and important stakeholders to try to tackle this.
And also, when you've got different news headlines coming through on what foods to eat, what foods not to eat, that makes the whole thing even more confusing and harder to really navigate, regardless of just factoring the cost of trying all these different foods within the diet, which might not even have that kind of effect. We've mentioned, a few different foods specifically like coffee, and I've also seen a bit talked about calcium and milk and reducing bowel cancer risk. Could you talk a bit about that area?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting question. So there has been emerging evidence from human studies that people who are consuming higher amounts of calcium in their diet have a lower risk of bowel cancer. And there are experimental studies showing that calcium potentially could have anti-tumorigenic properties. So, for example, binding, for example, bile acids, which are certain acids which occur in our intestines, which have cancer-promoting effects. There have been some recent very large-scale studies in the UK and in Europe and elsewhere showing that calcium and milk consumption lowers risk of bowel cancer, and we can combine epidemiological data with experimental approaches to investigate milk and dairy in relation to bowel cancer. So I think there is strong evidence from human studies. We still don't fully understand how calcium might be protecting against colorectal cancer risk, but I think this is an area of interest. And
also, I think with calcium, we have a lot of plant milks on offer as well, and so they use added calcium to hit those nutritional targets for us. But how does supplementation start to be a different conversation when we're talking about cancer risk? Yeah,
so I would say that the evidence around supplements and cancer risk is really inconclusive. So there were some randomized controlled trials conducted primarily in the United States on multivitamins, but also looking at calcium and vitamin D. There was a very famous trial, the Women's Health Initiative, conducted back in the 1990s and early 2000s, which looked at the effects of calcium on different health outcomes and really didn't show a strong effect. So it wasn't really shown that supplementation reduced risk of bowel cancer, and other trials looking at multivitamins and other supplements came to similar conclusions. So I think supplements could be useful for people who feel that they're lacking certain vitamins or minerals for overall health, but I wouldn't recommend them to be used for cancer prevention. I think it's much more important to obtain all the relevant nutrients and from the diet.
Is there a specific reason why? Is it mainly because I imagine maybe there's something to do with absorption?
Yeah. So I think there are a few elements here. So firstly, as you say, it could be around how our body absorbs certain supplements and minerals and compounds. We know that certain vitamins and minerals require what we call cofactors. They require other compounds to be present to facilitate absorption and the metabolism and their metabolism. So the lack of those, which would come with supplements, means that maybe the beneficial effects might not be felt. The other aspect is around dose. So it's possible that some of these compounds in supplements are at extremely high dosage levels, which might be counterproductive to their effects. Again, we don't really know why supplements might not be as effective for cancer prevention as, say, obtaining nutrients and other kind of relevant dietary factors through the regular diet. But
and I guess, you know, there are loads of different products out there, like pushing, like something that comes to mind is green powders, you know, with where they claim, you know, they've got all these different fruits and vegetables in a powdered form. You know, we say that fruit and vegetables are important in our diet. When it comes to things like that, does it count, or is this also more marketing?
I'm very skeptical about these sorts of things. I mean, the bottom line is we don't have good evidence that eating these sorts of powders and supplements impacts your health or cancer risk. You could say in theory, if these powders contain all the different compounds which are found in fruits and vegetables, maybe they could have effects on our health. So I'm not saying they don't, but we don't have evidence that they do. So far, all the evidence from population-based studies has come from eating whole foods. So my take is that based on the evidence, it would be better to obtain these nutrients and compounds by eating a balanced whole food based diet.
And if someone was to ask, you know, I want to have a healthy diet that can help reduce my cancer risk, what would you recommend to them? What would that look like?
So I would say that it should be primarily following the kind of national health guidelines. So eating 5 portions of fruits and vegetables per day at least, supplementing that with whole grain bread, rice, pasta, so ensuring that you get sufficient fibre, eating lots of beans, pulses, lentils, and maybe small amounts of fish, small amounts of meat, maybe once or twice a week, if you feel that you need to eat meat. But really, I think a lot of these things are really common sense. So the kind of guidance we've been given for many years now about eating kind of primarily a diet based around fruits, vegetables, whole grains, beans, pulses, and then small amounts of fish or meat. I would say that would be my advice.
Thank you so much, Marc, for joining me on this episode.
Thank you for having me.
Talking about certain foods and cancer can be a tricky subject and can often lead to a lot of health misinformation circulating, whether that's from false claims on social media to sensationalised headlines in news articles. My next guest, Dr. Rachel Orritt, is a health information manager at Cancer Research UK, where it's her job to sift through all this information on cancer and diet. And she's here to help explain and myth bust some of the biggest food and cancer claims with me. Rachel, welcome to the podcast, and thank you so much for joining me.
Hi, thanks. Nice to be here.
So, like I said, there are loads of sensationalised headlines out there. There's loads of information to do with food and cancer. How much of it is true?
It's a difficult question to answer because there's certainly a lot of misinformation. It can be quite a minefield, I think, particularly if you're spending a lot of time on social media, seeing different bits of content come through about diet and not really knowing how to separate fact from fiction or how to know what to trust. So we've got a number of tips at Cancer Research UK that we follow to try and help people understand, how to separate the wheat from the chaff, really. So some ideas are things like looking at the source. So where is that information actually coming from? if it's from a more reliable source like the CRUK website or like the NHS website, you can know and really have a good degree of trust that that's been through processes to evaluate the evidence as a whole and reflect that in an accurate way. But unfortunately, with misinformation, a lot of it is there for a purpose. So it might be to sell a product or to get some engagement, and the things that are most engaging around diet are things that seem actually quite extreme. Sometimes it's not done intentionally, though. Sometimes it's just, people are really thinking that they're helping by sharing some information that maybe hasn't been checked fully. So it is definitely a big issue at the moment.
And how do you think this sort of misinformation comes about? How does it get mistranslated from a study to an article?
It can happen in a lot of different ways. I think one of the things to say first is it is quite difficult to take a study and translate that into messaging that actually is helpful and useful for us in our everyday lives. So we have specialist teams at CRUK that do this for us. And one of the main things that we look for when we're looking at evidence is really good quality evidence. So when it comes to things like diet, we're actually looking at studies that involve humans first and foremost, and often have sort of hundreds of thousands of participants. So really big scale studies that we're basing our messaging on. But what often happens is you'll have a single piece of research, perhaps in mice or in cell lines, and you find that it's almost taken out of proportion to what the study actually found. So you might have a study that looks at, okay, what sort of conditions do cancer cells grow best in? So some studies looked at this and found that more acidic conditions mean that cancer cells grow and proliferate more. And what happened with that piece of information is it got turned into, okay, maybe acidic diets are to blame for cancer cases. So that's a big stretch to go from cancer cells in a lab growing under certain conditions to acidity in our diets causing cancer. And just to be very clear here, acidic diets or alkaline diets don't really affect the pH in our bodies. So yeah, that's not something people need to be concerned about.
Just like you said, just saying acidic, I'm already thinking about the alkaline diet that circulates, on social media and stuff. Yeah. So it's really easy just to draw your own conclusion from something that may not actually be what the study is trying to communicate.
Yeah, 100%. So what we do when we look at evidence is we look at evidence across a whole range of studies. So I like the phrase, no single study does science make, which sounds a bit Yoda-ish, but essentially what it's saying is, we can't put together a message based on a single study, because to look at a certain issue, take, let's say, processed meat, we know we have good, reliable evidence that processed meat increases the risk of bowel cancer. So how do we know that? Well, we first have to look at the different mechanisms that are at play. So there are preservatives added to processed meat that actually can do damage on a cellular level. Okay, so now we know it's plausible. Let's take that and look at it in a real life situation in humans, and let's do it at scale. So there you start to see how we need to build up this kind of evidence from lots of different angles to really know for sure what can cause cancer. So yeah, it's not ever as simple as a single study and messaging based off that.
And those sorts of studies also take time to get that information.
They really do, yeah. So this is one of the difficulties in studying cancer, because cancer takes a long time to develop. It's about damage that occurs to cells sometimes over the course of decades. So really, a good quality study will follow up people for 10, 20 plus years. And that's the best evidence that we have to be able to say, okay, we're starting to see patterns, we're starting to see trends, and start to investigate from there.
So you work as a health information manager at Cancer Research UK. So I imagine you must get quite a lot of misinformation coming across your desk, or information and studies that you kind of need to be careful with when communicating. What are some of the big ones that have come across your desk?
Absolutely. So we get all sorts in terms of trying to unpick what is related to evidence and what actually is just maybe a fad or a trend that people are talking about. So one of the interesting ones that I've looked at recently is people talking about apricot kernels, for example. So these are like the seeds or the pips within apricots. And some people saying, oh, perhaps they have a protective effect. So this actually isn't true. And unfortunately, it's one of those cases where misinformation can be quite harmful, because apricot kernels contain a chemical called vitamin B17. So it's not actually a vitamin, it's a chemical. And that can cause cyanide poisoning if you have enough of it. Wow. So, I mean, that's quite an extreme example, but it just shows how misinformation can really actually impact our health. So, yeah, I mean, I guess there's other things that are less extreme, things like we've had in the past are, do eggs cause cancer? Does coffee cause cancer? Does soy cause cancer? And they all come from different areas. So you take the soy, for example, people were suggesting that because it's got isoflavones in, which are a bit like, they work in a little bit of a similar way to estrogen. So they're kind of like a weak estrogen. And estrogen is related to some types of cancer development. So people were suggesting, oh, perhaps soy increases the risk of cancer. It doesn't. But you can see how these things start to develop, because people put sort of 2 and 2 together and come out with 5. And that's can sound a little blamey, but actually it's an easy thing to do. Some of these conclusions, if you're not fully immersed in the diet world and looking at the evidence all the time, how would you know? So that's why we really encourage people to think about finding reliable sources of information. And when you come across information that you're not sure about, cross-reference, cross-check that with reliable sources like the NHS website or the Cancer Research UK website, just to make sure that you're on the right page.
It's important to almost approach these sorts of information with a critical mindset and just not take everything as fact. But actually, science is an evolving field. It's one where, as more and more studies come through, we start to get a better understanding. It's almost like a little jigsaw puzzle. Like the more and more pieces you get, then you get to see what the picture actually looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we always talk at Cancer Research UK about being led by evidence. So it takes a long time to build up the evidence for us to say, you know what, guys, we are as certain as we can be on this topic that this causes cancer. So, your classic would be smoking. We are as certain as possible that smoking causes cancer. And it's also very impactful. So thinking about how we think about risk, we're dead certain that it causes cancer, and it causes at least 16 types of cancer. Then you take that to something like processed meat. We're as certain that processed meat causes cancer as we are that smoking causes cancer, but the impact is less. So it causes just one type of cancer, bowel cancer, and it causes much fewer cases of cancer in the UK than smoking does. So it's really interesting when we think about, okay, how do we start to put this together and think about how we can make healthy changes in our lives, and what's the most important thing to change? And this is definitely a topic of conversation that comes up often when we talk about myths or misinformation. Because actually, if we could just pull back and refocus on the proven causes of cancer, we could actually have quite a big impact on our own personal risk of cancer over time. So that's what we're really trying to encourage people to do.
I mean, it is quite, I guess, an attractive area when you think about specifically diet, because it's more controllable. It feels more controllable that you can pick, a certain food off the shelf and feel like it's helping protect you against cancer or that sort of information. But, in your opinion, like, why do you think a lot of people like to latch on to these misinformation statements, even though maybe they know it might not necessarily be true?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, and I won't pretend to know the full answer. I have my suspicions that, sometimes people, particularly on social media, there's a goal there. The goal is engagement and getting as many views, as many clicks as possible. And sometimes the proven causes of cancer are fairly boring, they're fairly run-of-the-mill. We're talking about having a diet that's high in high-fibre foods, whole grains, healthy sources of protein. and low in things like alcohol, processed and red meat, and foods that are high in fat, salt and sugar. So they're fairly standard messages. Some of those messages you'll have heard since you were a kid, eat your 5 a day, fruit and vegetables. And I think sometimes that doesn't quite make the news. It doesn't make the most interesting headline. It doesn't make the most viral content. So I can really understand why these different bits of misinformation really take hold. And like you say, we're all really interested in diet. We all eat, but it's not just that. Diet is and what we eat is a huge part of our social lives, sometimes our culture and our identity too. So it's just something we're innately interested in to begin with. So of course, these bits of content are going to be quite interesting to people.
And I also think there is perhaps maybe an aspect where to hear a certain food has a certain, might have anti-cancer properties. It might, for someone, they might think, well, if I buy this certain food, then I can put my money towards that and not have to focus on the big cost of a diet, which might also impact. I mean, we know that there are economic impacts on food and certain food choices. High sugar, fatty foods are just cheaper in our society. Yeah. But how does that affect cancer?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting area because some of the most impactful things we can do when it comes to our diet is not have a little bit more of this individual food or a little bit less of this individual food. It's about looking at the diet as a whole. So one of the tools we like to use quite a lot at Cancer Research UK is the healthy plate model. So this is a really nice tool because you can, whatever your dietary preferences are, or if you're vegan or veggie or neither, or if you have a certain culture that you eat, a cultural religious reason for food, the different food preferences you have, you can use this model. So essentially what it is if you can imagine a plate, half of that plate should be full with vegetables, fruits, salads. So you're already setting yourself off in a really good direction in terms of having a lot of fibre on that meal, and plenty of your vitamins and minerals as well. And then it also forces out some of the things that we want to have a bit less of. So whatever your diet and the food you like to eat are, you can sort of take it in the direction of being healthier overall by using that model. So it can be quite a useful tool. But yeah, to follow up on your point about inequalities, I think sometimes we can fall into the trap of feeling like what we eat is entirely under our control, when actually there's a whole bunch of different factors that really go into what we buy at the shop and what we end up eating at home. So for some people, money is a big determinant of what they eat. This can be as simple as the cost of food. So a healthy, balanced diet is more expensive. And it's not just cost of things, but it's the relative cost. So you're choosing the cheaper option because why not, right? And then there's also kind of things that are a little bit less directly related, but still related to money. So things like the transport. Do you have a car to be able to go to the biggest supermarket where you've got all the choice that you could possibly have? Or actually are you a bit more limited and you only have the time to take public transport there once every couple of weeks, the rest of the time you're relying on the corner shop? It's these sorts of things that really impact how easy it is for different groups of people to have a healthy, balanced diet, and it's the reason why there's such inequality in terms of who has access to a healthy, balanced diet and who can make these healthy changes.
I think that's like a really important point to express, that it's not always the fault of the individual. There are other factors that means that people have hurdles
absolutely
to achieve a healthy, balanced diet. Also, just going back to talking about, the interest in specific foods, we know that obesity is the second biggest cause of cancer. So how do we sort of balance pushing that message and trying to tackle obesity while also trying to draw away this interest of certain foods being, almost these superfoods?
Yeah, well, you use the word there, balance, and I think that's a really key word here. We have to recognise that whether or not someone has a healthy, balanced diet and whether or not they are a healthy weight is almost never that person's fault. There's no blame there. Actually, we need to look upstream at what that person's circumstances are, what the barriers and opportunities that they have in their life are, to be able to understand if it's even possible for them to make the sorts of healthy changes that we know can have an impact on cancer. That being said, there are small changes that can really make a big difference. So one of the things I like to recommend is to start with something relatively small that you can keep up for a long period of time, because it's no use trying to change everything at once and then maybe only keeping up with it for a week. A better route is to pick one thing. So you might have listened to this podcast and think, actually, I'm going to try and eat a bit more, have a bit more fibre in my diet. What's the easiest way to do that? Perhaps swapping from buying white pasta to swapping to buy brown pasta, which has more of that whole grain content in there, so more of that fibre. Just do that to start with. Don't try and change everything at once. And then maybe in 30 days, 60 days, that's become part of your habit, part of your routine. So it's no longer something you need to spend energy on thinking about changing. And at that point, you can add something else in. And that's really the way to make these changes stick in the long term and to have that impact on your own cancer risk.
And I was just thinking there, you said, you mentioned pasta, and I was just thinking about how a lot of the things we think as good sources of fibre, can also be, you look a bit deeper and they might not be healthy for us. And this term healthy, like, what does that mean in itself? But I think my brain also goes to ultra processed foods in particular, because we can have things like bread being an ultra processed food, but then there are a lot of claims saying avoid ultra processed foods to eat. So what's your opinion around that topic?
I'm really glad you brought it up. So ultra processed foods, just to be clear about what we mean. So these are foods that go through a lot of industrial processing. They might have had things added like preservatives, artificial sweeteners, those sorts of things. A easy way to think about them is things that you wouldn't be able to recreate easily in your home kitchen. So there's lots of different examples of ultra-processed foods, and we can't treat them all the same, because there are some types of food that would technically fall under the definition of ultra-processed that actually can be part of a healthy, balanced diet. So I'm thinking about things like whole wheat cereals that have been fortified with extra minerals and vitamins. That's technically an ultra-processed food, but it's not something I'd be telling people to avoid. There are other examples, like you mentioned, some types of sliced bread are technically ultra-processed foods. There's lots of different things. So it's not necessarily the case that the amount of processing that a food has gone through is equal to its nutritional value. It's a really topical subject at the moment. There's a lot of conversation about ultra-processed foods kind of destroying our diets. Are they really the reason why, there's so many cases of cancer? And what I'd say to that is it's almost not a very helpful grouping. What's a more useful grouping, in my opinion, is looking at foods that are high in fat, salt and sugar, because we know that those foods make it harder to keep a healthy weight. And when it comes to diet, that's one of the most impactful things, is that the kind of diet we have determines how easy or how difficult it is for us to have a healthy weight. And having a healthy weight reduces the risk of 13 different types of cancer. So yes, the ultra-processed food category includes a lot of foods that are high in fat, salt and sugar. And from that point of view, if someone wants to cut down on ultra-processed foods, go ahead. But I think the other important thing to recognise is some of these things aren't possible or easy to change for different groups. And it can almost become a bit of a classist thing, really. In that a lot of people rely on ultra-processed foods to get the energy that they need to make their lives work. And I think the figure is something around 56% of our diet across the UK is from ultra-processed foods. So it's not practical or realistic for us to, demonise them and throw them out completely. What's in my mind, a better approach is to think about the nutritional quality of different foods. And for foods that are giving us what we need, whether they're ultra-processed foods or not, I think, they can be part of a healthy, balanced diet. But obviously that depends on what they are. What I would say, just to be clear though, is processed meat is a cause of cancer, a direct cause of cancer. So when I'm talking about ultra-processed foods here, I'm kind of putting that to the side for a minute. But yeah, as a group, it is more complex than sometimes it's been made out to be.
We can get people that come to us and say, I've eaten a healthy, balanced diet and I still got cancer and I don't understand why. I think that it's important that we do clarify that risk doesn't always mean you're going to be able to prevent or avoid cancer.
Yeah, absolutely. There's no guarantees for any of us. You can have the most carefully put together diet, the most carefully put together life, and still develop cancer. It also works the other way around. So, there's nothing we can do in a preventative sense that would be that silver bullet that will absolutely mean that we will never develop cancer. And another thing that's important to mention is that we can never know for sure what caused any individual case of cancer. All we can do really is think about the things that we have evidence over a population increase or decrease the risk of cancer, and try and make those small changes so that we're stacking the odds in our favour, as it were.
And then in terms of getting more and more information down the line, what sort of studies are going to help us answer these questions that we do have around diet and cancer? So big expensive ones, really. We need studies that are representative of a UK population. So, and this is difficult because the UK population is wonderfully varied, and we need to really represent different people within that population. So we need to represent people from different ethnic backgrounds, people from different social groups, people with different, when we're thinking about diet, like religion, culture, identity, play huge parts in what we eat. So it really needs studies that represent those different facets of us as a population. Then we mentioned this earlier on, but having that length of time to really be able to see, okay, these patterns are developing and we think it might be because of this. Something that's really interesting when we think about the causes of cancer is we can't investigate it in the same way that we can investigate medicines and treatments. So with medicines and treatments, we have a good idea that something's going to do us well, it's going to benefit us, and we're able to kind of set up an experiment, give some people, the conventional treatment or a placebo, and then some people the treatment that we are hoping will help. And then we can do that experiment. But with looking at causes, it's completely unethical for us to, have one control group and then give another group of people something that we think might cause cancer. We would never be able to do that. So, and we would never want to. So we rely on these studies that actually take place over a period of time. The difficulty with that is it becomes hard to unpick whether two things are linked, so correlated, or whether actually one of those things is causing another. So this is where you get into that correlation versus causation, and how do you know what's going on? A really good example is if you think, I'm going to take us back to processed meat again, and I know I've mentioned it a lot, but it's a useful example because you might have a group of people where they eat a lot of processed meat, and you might see a higher incidence of cancer in that group of people. But let's say, for example, that processed meat is related to smoking. How would you know then that it's not the smoking driving that effect rather than the processed meat? So that's one of the reasons why we start talking about things that we need to control for. You can get quite into the weeds with all of this, and like, how do we carefully design a study that's going to show us, give us the most amount of reliability in a single study. And you can really carefully design studies. It takes a lot of thought, and it does take a lot of resource, a lot of money, and a lot of time. What we do at CIUK is we look at the evidence as a whole, and that is a really powerful thing because no study is perfect, but by looking at the evidence as a whole, you can
kind of take out some of those individual biases on those individual studies and start to really understand what's going on in the real world.
And then I think, on top of that, then there's the aspect of what we need from government and policy to help us create a more accessible, healthier life. And so I'm just kind of thinking as well, when we bring up things like, we know that processed meats and red meats are bad for us in terms of cancer risk. How do we start to make it easier for people to make healthier choices?
It's a big responsibility for the government. A lot of what allows us to have a healthy, balanced diet or to make these healthy changes happen, I talk about upstream. What I mean by that is we need economic stability. We need to address poverty. There's lots of things. We need to address the food system. There's these big problems that we need the government to take action on and continue taking action on so that a healthy, balanced diet is on the table for more of us. That sounds a bit cliche, a bit corny, but it is the case, we all deserve to be able to have a diet that is going to protect and promote our health, and also that is acceptable and something that we want to eat. We all deserve that. And I think, it's a huge responsibility of the government to make sure that the healthy, balanced diet is not just the healthy option, but it's an easier option, it's a cheaper option. Really important topic there.
There are still a few terms out there that a lot of people search in terms of cancer. One of them I think of is sugar. It's widely searched on how sugar and cancer are impacted. What's your opinion?
So there's no reliable evidence that sugar causes cancer in humans. Sometimes, I think we've touched on a few times in our chat today, we put 2 and 2 together and come out with the wrong answer. So all cells need energy to survive, including cancer cells. And this is where I think the myth around sugar came from. But you can't starve cancer cells because, you would end up starving yourself. There's no way to do that. So people don't need to avoid sugar for fear of it causing cancer directly. That said, having a diet that's high in sugar is going to make it a lot more difficult to keep a healthy weight. And as we've covered already, having a healthy weight is one of the main ways we can reduce our cancer risk. So if people are looking to reduce their sugar in general, they can do, and it's probably going to benefit them, but it's not going to have that direct impact on cancer risk that I think some articles and some stories have told us it might do.
And another article I'm just thinking of, another news story that came out, I think it was last year, was about aspartame, and it was classified as a type 2 carcinogen. Is that correct?
So there's a number of different sort of classification systems out there for the certainty that we have linking different bits of diet to cancer. Aspartame doesn't make the grade for a group 1 carcinogen. So this means that we don't yet have enough reliable evidence to be absolutely certain that aspartame, which is a type of artificial sweetener, is linked to cancer. The other thing about aspartame is that it's quite tightly controlled by the regulations that we have in the food system at the moment. So there's this thing called the sort of daily intake that is said to be the safe level that you can have. That safe level for aspartame is equivalent to drinking 14 diet pops. And you'd have to really be going some to drink 14 diet pops in a day. So it's not something that we encourage people to avoid. There's no reliable evidence that aspartame is going to increase your risk of cancer in humans. A lot of the times when there's this sort of uncertainty about factors, so we've got a bit of evidence, but it's mixed. Maybe some studies say yes, some studies say no. That can sometimes happen because there needs to be sort of a proof of concept first in research. So you might take a certain chemical and really increase the amount of that far beyond what any human would have in a given day, and then apply it to cell lines or a mouse or rodent study. that's not the same as saying that something causes cancer in humans. What we need to be sure of that is a study that looks at actually real people's diets in the real world and whether something is linked to cancer. So I'm always trying to encourage people to look out for the human studies, the studies that are on big groups of humans over long periods of time.
And do you think that's what maybe the media picks up? It sees this result that's happened in a cell line or in a mouse, and makes it spin into, well, this could happen in humans, but we haven't got the study for that.
Yes, exactly. And I think that's why it's really important to look past the headlines. You know, often a headline is there because it's designed to grab our attention. Something that really interests me when we talk about risk is you'll have a headline that says X doubles the risk of cancer. Now, doubles the risk of cancer could mean it goes from causing 1 in a million cases of cancer to causing 2 in a million cases of cancer. That's still a very small risk, absolutely, but it is also correct to say it doubles. So you can really get yourself in a tricky situation with trying to uncover what different headlines mean. If you look past the headlines and read the article, sometimes there's a quote in there, and that might be from someone at Cancer Research UK saying what they think about the evidence. It might be from someone at the NHS. It might be from the researcher. And that can often help you to start thinking, okay, how does this fit into the body of research as a whole? And is it strong enough evidence that it would prompt people to change their behaviour, or should prompt people to change their behaviour?
And so top tips for if someone's clicked on an article, they're reading something about food causes this much risk of cancer, what are the top tips to make sure they know if something is accurate or not?
Yeah. The first thing is, does it relate back to the things that you hear from the reliable sources? So again, I'm going to talk about that boring information. You know, a healthy balanced diet is one with lots of healthy sources of protein, lots of fruit and veg, high in high fibre foods and whole grains, and it's low in processed and red meat, alcohol, and high fat, salt and sugar foods. So does it fit with that picture, or does it feel quite wild and off? I mean, that's not to say that there aren't things that are causes of cancer or maybe protective that aren't within that broader message, but that's a good place to start. And I think also, if you are worried about something that you've seen and come across on social media, come back to what the proven causes of cancer are. Come back to the Cancer Research UK website. Often when stories like this hit, we cover them. So we might put a new webpage up about a certain topic, or we might have something to say about it. We might do a press release. So do come back and check in with what you know to be reliable sources. That would be a few top tips for you.
Rachel, thank you so much for joining me on this episode.
No worries. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to this episode of That Cancer Conversation. You can find more episodes on our channel, and don't forget to subscribe. And if you have any cancer questions you'd like us to explore for future episodes, let us know in the comments or email podcast@cancer.org.uk.